Okay, so once we get into part 3 of Atonement, the style changes again. So we've had a sort of 19th century style in the first part. It's in clear chapters, it's chronological, it's got distinct characters, distinct plot. Then it's gone to something more modernist, so much more like in the 20th century. It follows a stream of consciousness style, it follows one man's thoughts as they wander. And now we get something that's almost postmodernist. It's a little bit more like what we get sort of in the 80s, 90s and noughties. It's part 3 is essentially a story about a story. It's following Bryony as she writes what becomes Atonement. So the style changes again. So again we see that maturing, that growing up as Bryony gets older and leaves that childhood behind. We also get in this section a bit of an irony really, because Bryony is still that person who's very desperate to have things neat and controlled. However, as the style changes, she starts to understand that that can't happen, that you can't have neatness and order. So there's a bit of a conflict really here between Bryony wanting to impose order and sort of accepting that you can't ever get it. And the answer that she arrives at is what we get right at the end, where she gives us a really neat ending, but at the same time she sort of accepts that that's only a neat ending because it's a story and because that's what everyone wants in a story. So 3 lines down on page 269, we're told that it's the blacked out city. Now contextually that's because the war's on. Okay, it's blacked out because, you know, there's the blitz going on, so, you know, they have to black out the windows. But compare that to end of part 1 where it's the white. Okay, here it's black, so, you know, quite literally there's a mark of innocence into sort of corruption and experience. However, I think there's also that idea that, bearing in mind in part 1, Bryony was innocent in one sense, but also saw the world in very black and white terms, didn't she? She was convinced that Cecilia was under threat, Robbie was a maniac. And so we also get that sort of colouring of that as well, that it isn't as simple as that. So on the one hand it's negative, on the other hand it's quite positive. We see that a few lines after that, we're told something was coming to an end. Contextually, that's sort of the innocence of the world, the war's starting, the way of life is changing. But also could you argue that that's Bryony's childhood sort of certainty that's coming to an end, in which case it's a bit more positive. When we get onto page 271, about a third of the way down, we're told about the nurse, Sister Drummond, who's sort of in charge of Bryony, okay? And we're told in another context she would have seemed motherly in a plumpness or even sensual, for her unpainted lips were rich in natural colour. So she becomes this mother figure, this very stern, very severe woman becomes that sort of mother figure to Bryony. Very, very different to Emily Tallis. But it's almost that idea that that's what Bryony's been lacking, that sort of sense of discipline and order. And that actually allows Bryony to find herself much better than Emily did. Almost exactly halfway down page 271 we get a little mention of Nurse Langland. I think that's important because Langland, the surname, is the surname of an author who wrote in the sort of in the Middle Ages, wrote Piers Plowman, and it's a story about redemption. It's about somebody who sins and finds the correct way of living after that. So I think we get a little signal there. Remember, this is a part about writing, and we get a little intertextual reference to another story that hints at that idea of redemption here. But again, it's only through literature, it's only through words, it's only through stories that Bryony can get that. We're told that at the bottom of 271, a theme that continues really throughout, that these women have to model themselves on Florence Nightingale. They're all the same, they lose their individual identity. Again, they have to do that contextually because they're nurses and they have to forget their own feelings, they have to just get on with the job. But also in terms of the novel, it's important, isn't it? Because Bryony's losing that really strong sense of identity. And actually within doing that, she's almost finding herself more clearly, she's finding the right answers. And we're told at the top of page 272 that a nurse can never communicate to a patient a Christian name. Bryony loses a name, but ironically sort of finds a clearer identity as a result. About halfway down page 272, we're told that the students scoured, wiped and dried bedpans and bottles till they shone like dinner plates. For AO3, for context, that's great, isn't it? We've had that big posh dinner at the Tallises in part 1. Now Bryony's the one scrubbing the plates. Again, it's that changing world. That class system doesn't exist in the same way. We're told about Fiona on page 273, who becomes Bryony's friend. Right at the bottom, we're told that Fiona needs Bryony to help her out to cut her fingernails because her mother had always done it for her. So again, we get the sense of the absent mother figure here. These are girls who sort of need mums who aren't there. But we're also told just after that she's ginger haired and freckled, so she's very much like Lola. But we're told right at the bottom of the page, but unlike Lola, she was loud and jolly with dimples. So we get the sense again that Bryony's sort of seeing these signs and symbols and signifiers as being a little bit more complex than maybe she understood before. She can see something now and infer something very different as a result. She's not seeing the world in such obvious black and white terms. We find out about that loss of her name, loss of identity on page 275. The middle sort of paragraph, we're told that it's a stripping away of identity. And then we're told she was B. Tallis, not as it said on the little rectangular brooch, N. Tallis. Basically, she can't give away a Christian name, she has to just be B. Tallis. She says, well, hold on, you know, you've put N. Tallis on my badge, it must be a mistake. What she's told is no, it's Nurse Tallis. So she loses that first name, she loses that identity. It's stripped away from her. We're told a few lines before the bottom of page 275, she's adapting to unthinking obedience. Okay, she's losing herself, but ironically sort of finding herself by doing that. She's losing that very clear sense of that she is right, and actually she's seeing the world more clearly as a result. We're told on page 276, about a third of the way down, their previous lives were becoming indistinct. So again, that clear identity is disappearing. About 2/3 of the way down page 276, we're told that Bryony's parallel life, which you could imagine so easily from a visit to Cambridge as a child to see Leon and Cecilia, would soon begin to diverge from her own. So because of the context, because of the war, she thinks that life I had planned for myself actually isn't going to happen. But again, there's irony there, because this is where the reality starts to diverge from the story. Bryony in the story becomes very different to Bryony and what actually happened. So again, what's going on in the story is echoing the world outside and the context outside, just like the black text windows at the very start. We're told on page 276, about 3 lines before the bottom, she was delivered from introspection. It's another little religious reference there, okay? In the Lord's Prayer we're told, deliver us from evil. And I think there's a deliberately religious tone there, okay? It's about deliverance, isn't it? She's rescued from introspection. She's rescued from becoming obsessed with these ideas of order and neatness and right and wrong, and actually as a result understands things a little bit more clearly. We're told on page 277, just before the little break, she remembered the unease that was out there in the streets as well as in the wards, and was like the darkness itself, nothing in her routine, not even Sister Drummond could protect her from us. So there's that idea that Bryony still strives for order, but now she recognises it, and she also recognises that the world isn't as neat as that. She's actually attained a higher level of understanding of herself, hasn't she? She accepts her own need for order, but understands the world's not as clear as that. Just like at the end, she says, look, I let Robbie and Cecilia live because I needed to, but she accepts that the reality isn't quite like that. As it goes on, Bryony is dwelling on the fact that many of these women are mourning for their mothers. We're told 2/3 of the way down page 277, it seemed theatrical to Bryony and ridiculous. Grown young women tearful for their mothers and for Daddy's pipe. It's that fracturing of the nuclear family, isn't it? We're seeing the nuclear family and all those common symbols of it, but Bryony sees it as ridiculous. We're told at the very bottom of page 277, she didn't want her mother to know about her life. She's finding her own identity, and she can only do that away from Emily Tallis. We're told that again at the top of page 278, especially a mother, we're told, needs to know as little as possible. To find her own identity, she needs to get away from Emily Tallis, just like Louisa needs to get away from utilitarianism. We're told on page 278 and 279 that the vase has been destroyed. Remember, that is a symbol of all sorts of things. The class system, the Tallis family, the story itself. Okay, and we're told on 278 to 279 that has been destroyed. I think that is absolutely crucial. That symbol of all those things has gone. And then as it goes on to the last couple of pages of this section, we get the feeling that basically Bryony's finding her identity. At the very bottom of page 280, we're told at a time when she was cut off from everything she knew, family, home, friends, writing was a thread of continuity. So she needs to leave everything behind to find a true identity as an author. And that's the theme that's carried on throughout part 3. Halfway down page 281, we're told she could hardly remember a greater pleasure than when she squared off the completed pile of pages. She still wants order, she still enjoys order, she still feels safe, but she accepts that the world isn't as neat as that. We're told 2/3 of the way down page 281, the age of clear answers was over, so was the age of characters and plots. Okay, the style of part 3 is different because she accepts that the world has changed and the style of writing has changed. But when she tries to write something that is more, as she sees it, modernist, she's told in the letter that doesn't work either. She needs to go back to the plot. The only way she finds a voice as a writer is when she understands that she needs order, but the world itself isn't as neat as that. She wants childhood innocence and that sense of right and wrong, but the world itself isn't quite as neat as that. And I think that sums up a lot of part 3.